1939. As the Nazis march to war, Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler become obsessed with proving a crazed theory.
What they promoted was the idea of a superhuman Aryan master race.
A special SS division searches the sacred sites of the world for evidence of Germany's alleged Aryan heritage. Ancient rock formations they believe are long-lost temples of solar worship. Forest groves where they believe a sacred tree was once worshipped. And temples in Tibet where they think an Aryan super race founded Buddhism thousands of years before.
Pretty much everywhere that Indiana Jones had gone to encounter Nazi hoodlums, there the Nazis really had gone themselves.
By hijacking these sacred sites, the Nazis are attempting to justify an ideology that will have horrific consequences for the lives of millions. Deep in Germany's Teutoburg forest stands a remarkable rock formation. Consisting of 5 massive sandstone pillars, it is known as the Externstein. The Externstein has been a sacred site for Christians for over 1,000 years. In the Middle Ages, undertaking a pilgrimage to Jerusalem was a step too far for most Christians. Pilgrims came here instead to seek God's blessing at the Externstein.
The theory is that the whole ensemble of the Externstein is a copy of the Holy Grave in Jerusalem. The idea was that instead of going to Jerusalem, the pilgrims could come to the Externstein.
Medieval Christian monks dug grottos into the limestone rocks. Their hand-cut caves generated mystery for the faithful, invoking the burial of Jesus of Nazareth. On one of the rocks is a monumental relief sculpture depicting Jesus' descent from the cross. The relief is as striking today as when the monks first carved it over 1,000 years ago. Far above, on what is known as the Tower Rock, is another extraordinary feature, an ancient Christian sky chapel.
So this is the chapel. As you can see, we have a carving here in one of the side walls of the rock with a circular window in it and a kind of altar. It was used for Christian service because we have everything here that is significant to a church.
But in the Nazi era, this circular window becomes the subject of intense speculation. When amateur archaeologist Wilhelm Teut examines the Externstein in the 1920s, he becomes convinced that it will prove a highly controversial theory. Teut's theory is that thousands of years before the Christian age, the Externstein was used as a sacred site by a highly sophisticated race of Germans. Many contemporary archaeologists, however, were dubious about the theory.
Teut was regarded by his contemporaries to be a madman.
Teut discovers that the sky chapel's window is aligned precisely to the summer solstice. He becomes convinced that this could only have been achieved by an Aryan super race.
What is important to realize is that after the First World War, ideas that nowadays would seem rather bizarre to us gained traction at the time.
Defeat in World War I leaves Germany humiliated. Compounding their chaos, the German people face a ruined economy, rising global competition, and for many, the weakening of their Christian faith.
People then were searching, longing for new ideas, new myths, new concepts of transcendence, and there was a certain willingness to believe the unbelievable.
This potent atmosphere gives rise to the neo-cultural Völkisch, or folk tradition movement.
The Völkisch movement started at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century that gathered anti-Semites, eugenicists, religious prophets. One central element that combined them all was racism.
The notion that the Germanics were the great coming representatives of the Aryan race became very central to the belief systems of the Nazis.
One radical belief embraced by many Nazis is known as the cosmic ice theory. It was dreamed up by an Austrian railway engineer, Hans Horbiger.
He claimed that the rise and decline of civilizations on Earth can be explained by the occurrence of cosmic ice.
This quasi-religious scientific theory proposes that the universe is made of ice and that the stars of the night sky are balls of ice reflecting light from our sun. The theory proposes that tens of thousands of years ago, a ball of ice collided with the Earth, sending fragments rebounding into space to form our moon. This celestial collision is supposed to have sunk the mythical island of Atlantis, forcing the Aryan people who live there to flee and spread out across the planet. The Nazis decide it is their destiny to reinstate these Aryans at the heart of the Third Reich, their new German Empire. In the heart of Bremen, in northern Germany, stands an extraordinary building. Completed in 1931, Haus Atlantis was designed as an institute for the study of Atlantis and the Aryan superrace. The building's facade was originally adorned by a large wooden sculpture depicting the Nordic god Odin, crucified on the Tree of Life. Inside Haus Atlantis, an astonishing stairwell, built of glass and steel. It may evoke the Aryan exodus from Atlantis. At the top, the visitor enters a mysterious room. Known as the Heavens Hall, this was to be the teaching forum for the twisted ideologies of Hermann Wirth.
Hermann Wirth was quite fascinated by the idea of finding Atlantis. His idea was that this Atlantis was not somewhere in the Mediterranean or something like that, but in the North Atlantic region. And in his idea, in Atlantis, 20 to 25,000 years ago, a Nordic race was created that was to control and influence the development of mankind to a strong degree.
Soon, the highest echelons in Germany are paying attention to Wirth's bizarre pseudo-history. In 1935, Himmler joins forces with Wirth to establish the Ahnenerbe, an elite SS unit consisting of archaeologists, scientists, and historians. Their mission? To search the sacred sites of the world for evidence that the Aryans of Atlantis were not mythological. Himmler wants proof they actually existed.
As head of the SS, Himmler was fascinated by the idea of proving the supremacy of the Nordic race, and he was the strongest supporter of archaeologists researching on prehistoric German grounds.
The Ahnenerbe turned their focus on ancient sacred sites, among them the Externstein. A major excavation begins, commanded by Wilhelm Teut. Their mission is to prove that the Externstein was used for sacred rituals by Nordic German descendants of the Aryans, thousands of years before it became a Christian sacred site.
During the search for their Germanic Nordic roots, the Externstein comes to symbolize pure German heritage. The excavations at the Externstein become Himmler's pet project.
Meanwhile, Himmler sends Ahnenerbe teams across the world to hunt for proof of the German people's Aryan origins. But modern research is proving that the Nazi theories were fundamentally flawed. Bohuslän, on Sweden's western coast. Situated under a carpet of forest spread over 600 acres and hundreds of rock slabs, this ancient sacred site is home to the earliest recorded rock art in Nordic Scandinavia. Over thousands of years, the geological movements of the Earth's crust have changed this landscape. When these petroglyphs were first carved, they were right beside the sea. The land has moved so much that these sacred artworks are now many kilometers inland. Still today, the petroglyphs are revealing their secrets. Cutting-edge radiography is helping the site curator, Dr. Johan Ling, reveal details that are invisible to the naked eye.
We find new features, we find new images, we find new details that enable us to interpret the rock art. For instance, this warrior has been interpreted having an arm ending up in an axe, but with this new technology we can show that he's rather instead grasping a sword, swinging and grasping a sword.
Johan and his team believe the petroglyphs were carved by people who lived here 2,000 years before the Vikings. Similar carvings are found in Spain and Portugal, suggesting these boatmen traveled great distances as they searched for the most valuable material of their age, bronze.
In general, we're speaking about slaving, raiding, and trading already in the Bronze Age.
Among the boats and warriors are other strange symbols, including reindeer and discs that may be planets or suns.
They have probably a meaning connected to eschatology, to the life after this.
Ancient cultures have not only one level of understanding in depicting something. There are several levels of understanding.
In Neolithic times, reindeer, whose antlers fall off each year and then regrow, represented the resurrection of the soul. The boats are thought to carry the soul into the afterlife.
They also have an important meaning in terms of cosmology. There are ideas that you connect the boats with the journey of the sun, so to speak.
So there are two levels, a level having to do with practical things and a level having to do with ideological things of cosmology, of human ideas about life and so on. And this is very, very important, but it's difficult to decode.
SS Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler is convinced the mysteries of Bohuslän can be unlocked. And in 1936, he invites Hermann Wirth to lead an SS Ahnenerbe expedition to Sweden to examine the petroglyphs. Based only on a hunch, Wirth proposes that Aryan people carved these petroglyphs many thousands of years before the Bronze Age.
I think that Hermann Wirth had very crazy ideas. Hermann Wirth's ideology was that culture is coming from the Aryans and that they had a kind of solar cult. and that this idea is going back to Paleolithic epoch.
Wirth conveniently ignores the boats, warriors, and reindeer. Instead, he focuses solely on the sun-like discs. He believes these images are part of an Aryan alphabet system designed on the sun's movements through the sky.
He connected these to the Aryans, and he connected all things in the world to the Aryans.
Wirth makes casts of the carvings and sends them to Germany as evidence for the existence of the Aryan race. Museum director Dr. Gerhard Milstru has spent years tracking the casts down and has returned them to Sweden.
Here are some of the castings, and they would try to use this material to prove that the right race, so to say, came from Scandinavia. This is probably a symbol for the sun. We also believe this is a symbol for the sun. And this symbol is connected to the swastika, which also is a symbol of the sun.
Adolf Hitler had swept to power under the banner of the swastika. The swastika's design is based on an ancient spiritual symbol used for more than 3,000 years in places as far afield as Tibet, Ethiopia, and Nordic Scandinavia. Wirth and the SS Ahnenerbe became convinced that the carvings in Bohuslän included an early version of the swastika. But if Wirth was right about the Aryan connection, the carvings would need to be at least 12,000 years old and be the work of a highly sophisticated people who once lived here. Modern carbon dating and science, however, have now accurately dated the petroglyphs. All scholars are convinced they are from the Bronze Age. They are no more than 3,000 years old.
Wirth was wrong with his dating, several thousand years. They are from the Bronze Age, there's no doubt about that. We speak about 1700 to 500 BC.
Germany, 1930s. Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler are convinced that 20,000 years ago, mythological Aryans really once existed. These Aryans were said to have mastered the sciences and founded great civilizations across the world, including ancient Egypt. Desperate to prove this wild theory, the Nazis searched the world for evidence. In eastern Germany, a sacred site only discovered in the 1990s might look very much like the kind of evidence of a technically sophisticated master race that Himmler was searching for. Built 7,000 years ago, Gossik Circle is the oldest celestially aligned temple in the world. 2,000 years before the pyramids of Giza, Gossik functioned as a solar-aligned sacred site. The structure consists of 3 concentric circles. 2 entrances of the Gossik complex align precisely to sunrise and sunset on the winter solstice.
The leaders know where the sun is rising up, the exact points, they know the calendars, they know all the things to manage time, and so they had power.
Cultural astronomer Dr. Michael Rappengluck has studied the solar alignments at Gossik. Though its builders understood the movements of the sun sufficiently to align to the solstice, that was the limit of their knowledge. A similar awareness of solar alignments can be found in prehistoric stone tombs throughout Europe. But something else turned up at Gossik. A headless human skeleton was found buried near a portal. It suggests that 7,000 years ago, human sacrifice was practiced here.
The human is the most significant sacrifice humans can give to nature.
For Neolithic people, human sacrifice is seen as necessary in times of exceptional crisis, such as crop failure and war.
They think that the cycles of nature, especially fertility cycles, can be ensured by doing such a sacrifice. Humans think that it is necessary to feed such a construction.
As it was only discovered in 1991, the Nazis never visited Gossec. Had they found it, they would probably have manipulated it to fit their theories. But at 7,000 years old, Gossec is not old enough to fit the Aryan dating range. And though Gossec's scale is spectacular, it is built of mud and wood, hardly evidence of a technically superior culture that the Nazis were searching for. Even so, in the late 1930s, Himmler's work continued unabated. At the Externstein, his team imagines they have found the proof they are searching for, evidence that a sacred tree trunk, the most sacred device of the ancient Germans, once stood at the Externstein. "80 kilometers southwest of Hanover stands the Hermannsdenkmal, a massive 19th century statue of the Saxon warrior Arminius, the commander who defeated the invading Roman Empire. Desperate for symbols of strength and power, the Nazis adopt Arminius for propaganda purposes.
For many Nazis, and for Hitler at least in his public professions, Arminius was indeed a representation of pure Aryan might.
The Nazis place Arminius at the heart of their propaganda, for they believe that this site is where ancient Germanic tribes once stood their ground. (9 AD), a massive Roman army marches north to the Teutoburg forest to suppress the Germanic Saxon tribes. The Germanic chief, Arminius, has been an officer in the Roman army. Now he will use his knowledge of Roman tactics against them. But modern archaeologists have found that the Nazis were commemorating the battle in the wrong place. The battle site is actually located 160 kilometers north, here in Kalkriese. A museum now preserves artifacts from the battle and bones of the dead. Among them is the bronze mask of a Roman officer. This field of war would have far-reaching consequences for the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe.
The Germans used this area because it's a very difficult and narrow area. It's like a fish trap. They were skilled, but they were trained for another kind of battle. Battle in an open field. But this was an ambush.
Arminius destroyed upwards of a quarter of the military might of the Roman Empire.
Writing years later, the Roman historian Tacitus describes the battle's aftermath.
In the center of the fields were the whitening bones of men, strewn everywhere or piled in heaps.
20,000 Romans die at the Battle of Varus. The German victory marks a red line through Europe, beyond which the Romans will never again cross. Europe's northern territories will remain in German hands for 700 years to come. Arminius's victory is seized upon by the Nazis as proof of their ancient power.
The first German national state was only established in 1871. So the Germans were strongly looking for their own national myth, and for those folkish-motivated researchers or scholars who were actually trying to trace a line from an early, however called, Nordic Aryan race to modern-day Germany, they would have needed a link in the middle, which would have been the Germanic tribes having some sort of feeling of belonging together.
But there is something else in Tacitus's account, a reference to a sacred grove.
After the battle, some of the Roman soldiers were clearly sacrificed in the sacred groves. Tacitus talks a lot about the sacred groves of Germanic religion. However, he speaks very much in terms of them as specific sacred sites.
The grove is the center of their whole religion. It is the cradle of the race.
Himmler believes the grove that Tacitus describes is in fact the most sacred ritual instrument used by the ancient Germans. A sacred tree trunk known as the Irminsul. Sacred trees can be found in most ancient cultures around the world. Native Americans have totem poles. The Irish have sacred oaks. What particularly fascinates Himmler, though, is that the Irminsul may connect the ancient Germans back to the Aryans of Nordic mythology.
In Norse mythology, Odin, of course, hangs himself on the world tree Yggdrasil. That's one of the central myths about Odin. And it's quite possible that Irminsul would have represented this tree.
Even the name Irminsul seemed to confirm this theory.
It's clearly composed of two different words, Irmin and Sul. Sul is easy, that means pillar. And Irmin, that in Old Norse, is used as an epithet for Odin.
Finding the archaeological evidence of the existence of one of these sacred tree trunks, or Irminsuls, becomes a priority for the SS Ahnenerbe. As they excavate the Externstein, Wilhelm Teut believes he has found a vital piece of evidence. On the carving of Jesus' descent from the cross is a curiously shaped structure.
There's a very strange, bent object, a little bit like a stool, but it's the wrong shape.
Teut is convinced this bent object is a representation of an Irminsul.
This becomes Teut's big idea. He says, this image, this is the Irminsul.
While even today no one knows for sure what an Irminsul actually looked like, Teut becomes convinced that the image in the carving depicts a sacred tree trunk. He believes it proves that an Irminsul once stood at the Externstein. But what had become of it? And why would an Irminsul be bending before Jesus on the cross? The German city of Aachen is home to one of Europe's most beautiful sacred sites, Aachen Cathedral. Built in the final decade of the 8th century, around the magnificent Carolingian octagon, it is a celebrated architectural masterpiece. It is also the burial place of one of the most powerful emperors Europe has ever known, Charlemagne. 762 AD. Charlemagne chooses Aachen as his front line. For 700 years, the Germans have ruled vast areas of northern Europe. Now Charlemagne will make them bow before his Christian empire. His first act, according to Frankish chronicles, is to seek and destroy the most sacred Irminsul in Germany.
When Charlemagne cuts down the Irminsul, it was definitely a symbolic act which replaced the old religion and meant that people were more or less forcibly converted into Christianity because their religious site was gone.
But the loss of the Irminsul makes little difference. And unbowed, the Germanic tribes fight on. Finally, after 3 decades of war, a frustrated Charlemagne rounds up 4,500 leading Germanic warriors and has every last man beheaded.
For many Nazis, Charlemagne was the butcher of Saxons.
To commemorate this massacre, Himmler builds a new sacred site in the Teutoburg forest. Known as Sachsenhain, it consists of 4,500 boulders, each stone representing a Saxon warrior killed by Charlemagne.
In 1934, local peasants were instructed each to bring a standing stone to the site. 4,500 were duly brought to it. And Himmler declared that this, after all, was sacred space, since wherever German blood was spilled on German soil, that soil was sacralized. The henge was vast. You could drop several football fields into the area. The landscape designer went on to design concentration camps in Poland.
Charlemagne's massacre brings the rule of the German tribes in northern Europe to an end. The Nazis perceive this moment as the end of an unbroken era of German supremacy in Europe, stretching back to the time of the mythic Aryans. They imagine the Externstein carving depicts an Irminsul bent in supplication before Charlemagne's victorious Christian empire. Himmler is convinced that an Irminsul must once have stood at the Externstein. He decides to erect a new Irminsul high on the rocks. Through it, he will harness the power of the ancients.
Himmler tried to transform the site of the Externsteine into a neo-Germanic cultic site.
Himmler demands that an extensive report be produced proving to the world that the Externstein was once a sacred site of the ancient Aryan Germans. And 40 kilometers south of the Externstein, he begins another major project, the building of a headquarters for the new Aryan super race. In the Teutoburg forest in central Germany stands an extraordinary castle. Built in the early 1600s, Wewelsburg was once the residence of the Prince-Bishops of Paderborn, statesmen of the Holy Roman Empire. Wewelsburg is within 40 kilometers of both the Externstein and the Hermannsdenkmal, Connecting these locations creates a triangle, a sacred symbol for mastermind of the Holocaust and the Nazi concentration camps, Heinrich Himmler. In the late 1930s, Himmler decides that Wewelsburg is to be the apex of the new Aryan Empire.
He was convinced that in that area, which he considered to be the heartland of the Germanic tribe, he would have to find a castle which would be home to a training institution.
At Wewelsburg, Himmler would indulge his most pseudoscientific beliefs. With a fund equivalent to 120 million of today's US dollars, Himmler sets about converting the castle. The work will be done by Slavic prisoners in a dedicated concentration camp built on the outskirts of the village.
There were altogether 3,900 prisoners here in Wewelsburg. Of these prisoners, 1,229 died by the conditions of forced labors, by direct killings by the SS men. And so 1/3 of all prisoners were killed here.
Though it remains unclear what exactly Himmler planned for Wewelsburg, many believe his ambitions were sinister.
It's a symbolic expression of the will for total power that Himmler had in mind for the SS.
Initial work focuses on the North Tower. The Obergruppenführersaal, with its black star swastika motif, will be a central meeting hall for senior SS officers. Below this hall, in the crypt, a gas flame will burn forever in a central pit. The skull rings and portraits of deceased SS officers will be on permanent display.
The idea being that the senior SS officers would gather in the presence of past generations of SS officers, so that you had a generational transmission of wisdom, ideology, cultic practices. And that created the conflation between past, present, and the future, which is a hallmark of myth-making.
As work begins on Wewelsburg, the SS Ahnenerbe go to ever more extraordinary lengths to prove the Aryan connection.
What was so peculiar about the Nazis' belief in an Aryan race was that the Aryans, they entirely accepted, were very widespread, so that they could surface everywhere from Tibet through the Middle East to Latin America.
The Nazis believe that after escaping Atlantis, one group of Aryans traveled to Asia and founded new cultures. They think that even Buddha himself was an Aryan. 1937. The explorer Ernst Schaefer approaches the Ahnenerbe to fund an expedition to Tibet. Himmler grants Schaefer the money on condition that he searches Tibet for the Aryan root race, blue-eyed people with blonde hair.
Here we really do get into Indiana Jones territory.
In Tibet, Schaefer meticulously records Tibetan culture and measures the people's physical features. Despite finding no proof of any kind, the expedition concludes that the highest castes of Tibetan society are descended from Aryan roots.
They faked it. They faked objects. For example, there had been a small statue of Buddha with a swastika on it. And it turned out it is a fake.
Desperate to find evidence of Aryan cultural activity that is at least 12,000 years old, the Ahnenerbe plan more expeditions. They consider expeditions to Bolivia and Mexico to examine the sacred sites of the Incas and Aztecs. But their journeys would have been wasted. Modern archaeology has dated the oldest of these sites to no more than 3,000 years old. September 1939. Hitler invades Poland. The war that will change everything has begun.
Most people in Germany were convinced that Germany had a special mission, was God's chosen country, and it was unthinkable that Germany would be able to lose a war.
The Nazis planned to cleanse Germany and their newly conquered territories of those they believed to be non-Aryan. The SS Ahnenerbe's twisted theories will have a terrible impact on the lives of millions.
There were convinced National Socialists who were absolutely fascinated by the idea of proving Nordic supremacy. Of course, it was quite a useful tool in starting the Holocaust and giving the Holocaust a sense of legitimacy.
The Nazis sent Slavs, Jews, and many others believed to be a threat to Aryan supremacy to concentration camps. 11 million are killed. Each death enabled by Himmler and the SS Ahnenerbe's fake science. As the war rages, Wewelsburg nears completion. The son of a concentration camp survivor has recently donated an architectural schematic to the Wewelsburg Museum. It reveals the scale of Himmler's plan.
Yeah, the castle is this triangle building here, right in the center.
The plan reveals that Himmler intended to demolish the entire town of Wewelsburg. In its place, he would build an enormous complex of triangular and circular buildings with the existing castle as its apex.
When you imagine this ein Obergruppenführer standing in the center of this whole compound, you can imagine that they would have had an impression of standing in the center, a symbolic expression that they are in the center of power. Himmler saw his SS in the succession of the medieval knights' orders, the elite of the medieval German society in a way.
Despite their pseudoscience, the expenditure of vast sums and the efforts of some of Germany's most capable minds, the SS Ahnenerbe found no hard evidence that the mythological Aryans had ever existed. So much of Nazi ideology was built on this impossible idea, an idea that would soon reveal itself to be a lie. The Externstein in Germany's Teutoburg forest has been a Christian sacred site of pilgrimage since the Middle Ages. But in the final years of World War II, it becomes the focus of an extensive study by Wilhelm Teut and the Nazi archaeologists. Teut believes that if he can find evidence that an ancient Germanic people used the Externstein for ritual practice centered around the sacred pillar called an Irminsul, it will prove that modern Germans are descended from the Aryans of Nordic mythology. But despite digging for 3 years, Teut finds nothing except a collection of rocks which he claims are the remains of a sacred altar.
They were basically just boulders, you know, that they were piecing together, saying it was a holy stone table. So you can see that they were desperately trying to find something that they could label Germanic.
And so they began creating alternative facts, inventing proof.
Modern studies of the Externstein have confirmed that no major ritualistic practice was conducted here prior to the Christian era.
There had been some radiocarbon dates, and they are going to the Middle Ages. So it is not very old.
There was no archaeological evidence of occupation for almost the entirety of the first millennium, and nothing pre-Christian.
But what of the bent icon in the middle of the carving of Jesus' descent from the cross? Wilhelm Teut had claimed this was an Irminsul, the sacred ritual device of the ancient Saxons.
This idea really came out of nowhere. It's one of the things that Wilhelm Teut really genuinely was making up.
The image in the descent from the cross is generally accepted to be a bent palm tree. It represents perhaps nature's sadness at Christ's death.
There was no Irminsul here at the Externstein. It's a modern myth.
The very idea of an Aryan race ever having existed is itself fundamentally flawed. Himmler and the Ahnenerbe were confusing Nordic mythology with the ethno-linguistic classification term Indo-Aryan. The Indo-Aryan language group consists of languages including Sanskrit, Arabic, and Romani, which have spread through the Near East during the last 3 millennia.
The notion of an Indo-Aryan race and an ancient race of Atlantis has no foundation in fact whatsoever. It was fabricated.
As for the solar-aligned window in the Externstein Sky Chapel, which Teut argued was proof of solar worship many thousands of years ago, experts point out that nearly all Christian churches have a similar window above the altar facing east towards the rising sun.
The ideas of Teut, Himmler, and all the others turned out to be Völkisch fantasies.
Himmler had commissioned a special report on the sacred site of the Externstein. This report was supposed to prove to the world that Germans were descended from a Nordic Aryan super race. Historian Roland Lind is among the few people to have read the report in full. He found it devoid of any verifiable scientific proof.
The Externstein is an example of the scientific misuse of ideological ideas. Teut even said himself that he did not care about scientific proof or evidence. And when science failed to prove things, he was happy to carry on regardless.
When it was completed, Himmler had the report suppressed because it had failed completely to prove the existence of ancient Germanic rituals at the Externstein. And after the war, it was revealed that many Ahnenerbe academics had been under duress while writing the report.
They invented the lot.
1941. America joins the war effort. And for the next 4 years, the Allies battle to stop the Nazi march. By the time the Nazis are conclusively defeated in 1945, over 50 million people will have lost their lives. Nazi ideology will be completely discredited. And yet, we must remain wary, even today, of how extreme ideologies can sometimes be accepted by masses of people.
Folkish ideas from the beginning on were racist, were anti-modern, yet they were presented in a form that sounded quite appealing to a lot of people 100 years ago. These ideas might present a vision of, let's say, a past world that sounds much more appealing and interesting to some people, especially in times of economic crisis or other difficult circumstances. So these folkish ideas have been pretty dangerous, and they will still stay pretty dangerous in the future.
The sacred sites of the world can sometimes serve as warnings of how the stories of the past may be manipulated to serve specific ideologies. but they can also offer us windows into the extraordinary lives of the ancients. Sacred sites like Gossik and the Externstein remain places where we can imagine Bronze Age warriors, ancient Germanic tribes, and Christian pilgrims searching for the meaning in life and seeking to commune with higher powers beyond the